Hello, and welcome to our Final Mile Logistics Landscape webinar. Today, we're going to be talking with industry experts that understand the market and how the final mile is essential in meeting modern demands for service expectations. My name is Michael Willard, and I'll be turning our webinar over to our speakers in just a moment. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. All of today's attendees are muted for the webinar. The session is also being recorded, and we'll share it with you shortly after it concludes. You can also look for a recording of the webinar in the resources section of our website, MercuryGate.com. It'll be available later. Our presenters have a lot of information to share, but we're planning to field your questions. Please submit those questions at any time using the Q&A feature on your Zoom webinar viewer. For any questions we don't address, we'll follow up with a response. Finally, when you leave today's webinar, please share your feedback in our short survey. With that out of the way, it's my pleasure to welcome MercuryGate Vice President of Product Marketing, Nick Wilson. He'll introduce the industry experts joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Michael, and thanks to our audience out there that's joining us today. We really do appreciate your time. As Michael alluded to, I've had the privilege of working with our presenters today to frame out what we hope is a meaningful conversation for all of you. Presenting today is Steve Blau. He's the co-founder of MercuryGate, and today is our Chief Innovation Officer. In many ways, and I know from experience, Steve is really the chief architect behind MercuryGate's smart transportation platform, bringing to bear more than 25 years of experience in helping customers improve performance and solve all sorts of supply chain challenges across their transportation network and really the logistics landscape. Senior Solutions Architect Travis Schmidt is joining Steve today as well for our final mile conversation. He is an expert in using tech to solve transportation management problems. Travis has spent the past 10 years focused on fleet and final mile logistics, where he keeps a pulse on changing trends, their impact on service demands, and the solutions to really meet customers' modern expectations, which are constantly changing. Those changing trends in final mile service is where we're going to begin today. So with that, Steve, I'd like to invite you to kick us off with the big picture.
Sure, thanks, Nick. It's great to be here again. Excited to chat about where things are in our industry. One of the great things about logistics and transportation is it's a landscape that's always changing, right? I mean, been in a lot of years, and I'm not sure any year seems the same to me. So it's exciting. And one of the great things is it's built in one of the few industries that's really built on an incredible number of relationships, right? So it adds a lot to the complexity and the need for the visibility, right? So, after dealing with the pandemic, of course, we're now we saw the prices of things like containers skyrocket, right? I mean, from China to the US, we have customers that were paying over $20,000 for per container. The good news is, right, that's now starting to drop down to pre-pandemic levels below $3,000. So things are starting to normalize again, get back to the regular prices, if you will. And that's kind of across the board, whether it's trucking or ocean or air, right? They're all sort of back to that pre-pandemic or reality look, if you will. Of course, what comes along with that is some of the weakness in demand. So it'll be a interesting year, but really hopeful that by the end of the year we start to see that uptick. And that brings us now to final mile. So obviously, final mile can be any mode, any move type, right? Even like we talked about containers a minute ago, those containers could be moving to a manufacturer, and that's the final mile, an entire container move or a dray move to a container or a rail move even, right? But today we're really going to focus on sort of the package level kind of final mile and talk about that a bit. We'll delve into some other areas, but think of whether it's B2B or B2C, think of the packages going final mile. And of course, first mile is very similar to that as well. And so, it's really that package level that we need to think about. So Travis, as someone, you've been around final mile for, a few years, right? And, lots of experience. And where do you see the industry today? I mean, the whole push-pull, expectations, et cetera.
I mean, Steve, you spoke about it a little bit. Final mile is, for whatever business is executing their final mile, is their final mile. And it's identifying that, a DC to store move traditionally would have been looked at like a middle mile move, but for the DC, that's a final mile. And And I think what, one of those macro trends that we're seeing is the expectations around final mile for your customer, whoever that customer is, the store is your customer in that case, is the same expectation that's driving kind of the B2C, which has always been that full visibility, predictive ETAs, all the way down into, the issues and the communication around when that final mile is getting to me. And I say final mile because, as we said, a DC to store move in a B2C or a B2B world, there's that higher touch point of execution that's kind of filtering down there. So yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time in final mile, and it's an exciting time in the execution of that, because we have that convergence of technology that's been happening over time, all coming together now. So very exciting from a standpoint of what it is.
And what do you think about the push versus pull world, right? I mean, it seems like, historically everything was being pushed out to stores in hopes that consumers would buy, I mean, obviously they're measuring some demand and so forth as well. But now it's a lot more of folks ordering it directly, right? And pulling it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the pull comes from, your computer or your phone is your actual store. So now you're not going out to the store, and then how does everything get there? So the push versus pull, and even, you saw that in manufacturing the years ago with the just in time. In a lot of ways was a great example of the pull, but the pulls happen on a consumer level probably in the last 5 years at a level that nobody could even, the uptick has been crazy, accelerated by the pandemic as well. With everyone being at home, it just accelerated the pull. So, it changes the dynamic, it changes loyalty to the brands, it changes loyalty to stores. Who can get it to me the fastest, who can get it to me not broken, who can get it to me and install it. All of those come into that decision in the pull economy, that in the push economy, where the manufacturer just pushed a pipeline down to, a final store, and then somebody went and picked it up, just, is totally been flipped.
Yeah, you make me think of brand loyalty, right? Like it used to be, I only shop for certain things. Right now, if I can't get what I want when I need it, I kind of just flip past the brand, right? And it's interesting. The other thing too is just the ease of getting those deliveries. I mean, think about, go out and order something online, and you expect it in a day or two. Well, you go to some sites and, you're there like, 25 clicks in and you're still filling stuff out. And it's like, I'll just go over here and buy it, right? It's funny how that expectations have changed for that, right? And how it's driven this whole final mile industry, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't think there's going to be one winner. I think everyone has the opportunity to win now. There's been a kind of a leveling of the playing field. You have a couple guys that got out in front, but then everyone's got the opportunity to catch up through the technology and the execution of that final mile using technology. I think it's kind of leveled that playing field for people who didn't have that technology spend that they used to find the right partners. So I think final mile is going to just keep accelerating. Service levels are going to keep improving. And it really comes down to meeting commitments, and what the commitment is. If I buy something online and they tell me it's 2 days, I'm happy because I've made that choice at that moment in time. And if it arrives in 2 days, I'm still happy. It's when it doesn't arrive in 2 days that my expectation starts to not get met.
Yeah, indeed. So let's move on and talk a little bit about what being great in final mile really means. So when you think about excellence and excelling in this area, what does that mean to you with your experience in final mile?
Well, I think it's who the stakeholder in excellence is. And let's, if you talk it from the customer's perspective, is what I order arrives on time when you said you'd, get it to me, and it's not broken, and you did what you said you'd do. You know what I mean? So there's excellence from a customer perspective. Then there's excellence from an operational perspective, and the stakeholder then being the company that's doing that. And then obviously from a billing and a financial perspective as well. So, to do all that, you need to go all the way through the optimization. You need to make sure that you're running optimal routes. You need to make sure that your drivers are presenting for you in the way that you want them to present for you, and then obviously meeting SLAs. So I think excellence spans a large swath of what it is, but it all comes down to running the most optimal final mile for your business definition of what optimal is. It could be cost, it could be on quickest delivery.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I always think of what's the cost to lagging behind, right? Like, what if, I see a lot of logistics companies that seem, or they think of parcel as the only final mile out there, right? And certainly it's a tool for final mile delivery, don't get me wrong, but there's so much more, right? And we're seeing a lot more of that, of logistics companies now trying to excel in this area and get better and better at handling those final mile legs, and and what that means of setting up cross docks, local distribution centers, whatever. It's driving almost a whole change in the industry, right? So I think it's keeping commercial real estate alive right now, really. But it's interesting to start to see that stuff moving and getting there. But at the same time, being excellent in that area is difficult. So it's the software and products that really start to get there. And then I think about too the automation that comes along with some of this thing. I mean, you mentioned optimization, but the AI and the automation part is really key to the final mile operation. Optimizing, we talk like optimizing is this simple thing. Well, it's very complicated because we're taking into account not just where we're going from and to, but now traffic. What if a return drops in the middle of that? What if someone cancels an appointment? The complexity is very high, and keeping that fresh and going, means that, the product or the software has to keep looking at what's happening and adjusting as it happens. And it's really a critical piece of final mile more than almost anything. No, look, it happens in all the others as well. It's just the time in a final mile delivery is so tight that you just don't have that bandwidth or leeway of stretching it out. So, is being great in final mile more attainable today with the tools that we have?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's really getting to that inflection point where you have the capability, and I wouldn't say an off the shelf, because I don't believe there's an out of the box logistics software that just works for everyone. It's customizing a great solution for your workplace to have all you need. You need customer communication. How do you want to communicate with them? Nobody wants to receive a phone call, so now you want to send them texts. Can you send texts? What type of text do you want to send? And how do you make sure that text means something? I love that message that I get 9 stops away, and I don't even know what that means, because I don't know if those stops are close. I don't know if those stops are 100 miles away, but I like to know, well, it's going to be there around 10:15 to 10:30 personally. And then that means something to me. It's a predictive ETA in time. My mind can think in time as a consumer, not in stops. I mean, we're in time and space and logistics, but so yes, is the technology available? Absolutely. Should everyone be looking at it right now? Absolutely. I mean, the playing field is level from a technology standpoint. I don't believe that's a constraint as it was in the past.
Yeah, it's funny because you say about the 9 stops away. I always look at the map they send, and the truck's like 4 houses down. Like, how can it be 9 stops away? Where's it going? Anyways, but so it obviously isn't just the software, as you mentioned, right? So, what are things that you often do to help customers or companies, excel at final mile during the training and setup process, right? Like, it's more than just turning on the software, right? It's all the things that go in it. And let me go back to logistics guys. A lot of times they don't know a courier to use, or a shipper might not know who could they use in this area to do final mile delivery besides, a parcel carrier, right?
I mean, that's the thing. You've still got this massive network of, local carriers. How do you start utilizing local carriers to do critical deliveries for you at a standard that is not a local carrier standard? It's at your standard. And that's a large part of what the software does, it normalizes the processes, and it normalizes the consistency of that process to deliver a uniform experience across all of those deliveries that you're making, those thousands of deliveries you're making. So it's we're a big believer in getting that data in a normalized, clean data set, and then executing it in a standardized process, and then also backing into what is that process of your business currently, and how can that be improved using the software, and how can we not break it first before we improve? How do you not break it? So yeah,
That's the last thing you want to do, right? Yeah.
No, 100%. So it's just a matter of like, it's always that crawl, walk, run. How do we replicate what you're doing, and then you must start optimizing that? How do you start taking, not head count, but miles and time out of the process? How do you take planning decisions to exception based, and not every single touch point that has to be made? And that's the continual process of improvement that happens.
Yeah, it's sort of that golden ring too of automation, right? Like, I always say it's a process. You can't just turn on automation, right? It's a step by step getting there. But again, with the right software and the right people in the software and processes, you can get there very successfully with limited knowledge to start, and then of course growing that knowledge as you improve or go forward.
Yeah.
So.
And you mentioned it earlier on, Steve. You spoke about continuous optimization, and what does that mean, and replaying the day. I mean, one of the the key technology pieces that was built in our environment was a simulator, which is basically, it's one thing to batch route, and it's a snapshot in time, and you're like, I've got 100 orders, need to get them on 10 trucks. Yeah, but what happens as you're adding orders during the course of the day, and then how do you model that and simulate that and make sure that the optimizers and the algorithms are considering all of those dynamic events that happen throughout the course of the day? So, those are some of the things. I always look at logistics like a video game. You have to be able to play the video game and then replay the video game with the same constraints.
You get better every time you do it, right? But it's interesting. You talk about simulator. When I first heard simulator, I'm thinking, it's going to run the optimizer. It's doing route planning. What's more than that, though, right? It's getting, it's actually having the trucks moving now in a compressed period of time, and seeing those movements, and then having a return drop or something happened as it's actually tracking or simulating this tracking of this truck that left at 10 o'clock, right? So it's a lot more than just, running it and looking at routes. It's looking at the routes as they execute, and then as changes happen, and you can look at it, in a future kind of world, or look at it historically and say, well, could I have done stuff differently to improve this process, right? And so it actually feeds in well to the whole process improvement side. 100%.
Yeah.
Okay, well, moving on to increasing demands. Okay. Obviously, the devil's in the detail here, right? And final mile could be very demanding. You think about things like we've mentioned already, ETAs, appointments changing, returns dropping, etc. I know something you're very familiar with was the whole cold chain thing, right? And how important that's become in the final mile world. So talk about a little bit about the assurance of the chain of custody and the Internet of Things of pulling all that information in, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how the depth and the connecting those data points has become, because chain of custody could just mean the driver taking it to the customer, patient, whatever. Now, chain of custody could mean from the first mile on the pickup event back to the DC, which cross-dock worker, where did he put it? When did he put it? Where did it move to the next place on the cross-dock? How did it find itself onto the next truck? In what compartment? Is it chilled? Is it ambient? Are there controls around? Can it be pulled in a chilled and an ambient? Then moving to the next compartment, and throughout that entire process, total chain of custody and visibility of package location from the pickup event all the way to the final mile delivery across multiple carriers. And it's a challenging exercise, and it's challenging, and obviously but critical. You have medication that's temperature sensitive. What happens if an entire batch goes out of temperature? It gets quarantined. What happens on the quarantine event? How does it get released? Does it need to get destroyed? Is the automated process back to destroyed and destruction automated, that all the legs back to the destruction event? Because you don't just destroy it in the truck.
Right. Well, you might, but yeah.
Not best practice.
Not intentionally, right? But
yeah. No, but it's interesting to see the increasing demands, and then all of the data points that come into those increasing demands. Now you've got a temperature feed, but you don't just have a temperature feed from vehicles. You have a temperature feed from warehouse locations. You have a temperature feed from dock locations on the dock, not just the warehouse. So you've got different zones in the dock. So and then how do you manage the movement into those zones and out of the zones that it actually represents the product there with scanning events, and what application does that? So I mean, exciting, because once you start to connect those dots, you see the power in visibility and control over that product.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say visibility, right? Visibility is often thought of tracking, right? And fair enough, it is, but certainly visibility is a lot more than that. It's visibility into, in this case, temperature, right? It's I think we had a client who was struggling with monitoring temperature through their whole process, and they were able to do that now with the assurance that the goods that they shipped, and the goods were $250,000, right? It wasn't like, hey, we need to know that this stuff's good, because if it goes out of compliance, it's ruined and it's a lot of money. So it's really important. So it's a visibility of we think of the Internet of Things, but it's that visibility of the different parameters like temperature that are just so critical to the transportation these days, and visibility to appointments, right? It's all those things.
Yeah, and it all comes down to those definitions. It's like,
sure does.
You're like visibility to the delivery event or the pickup event or the location. What does that mean? Every 5 minutes, every 3 minutes, every 2 minutes, and even the temperature feed, what does that mean? And, it's interesting you bring up that, also, the fact that the value of the merchandise that's moving through these cold chain networks is so high. So, you get to the thing of, well, something went out of temperature balance. Well, what should you have done before that? Well, we definitely should have had a warning when it was getting close to going out of temperature balance, so you could solve that. So how do you build in the warnings? And that's a large part of it. You have a range of 15 to 25 that you have to maintain something. Surely you should be warning around 17 and 23. Do you know what I mean? When that compartment is at 17 and 23. So, it gets very, 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 very technical and very specific, but at the same time, simple if you have the technology to support it. If you don't have the technology to support it, impossible.
Yeah, another area I think often about is, I mentioned it earlier too, returns, right? I think recently I read that something like 30% of all the clothing ordered online gets returned. It's a high number, right? And we've all gotten spoiled with the free returns or drop it off at a store nearby or whatever it is, right? There's all kind of ways to get things back now that don't cost any money. In fact, that often will drive some of my decisions when I'm buying something. Like, I might pay a little more here just because I know if I don't like it, I can return it for nothing versus, paying $50-$60 to return something, right? So, I remember, just to make a short story, right? Like, we had a clothing retailer. They told me, during the pandemic, a lot of these guys, they started shipping out. They had to, right? Started shipping out all these goods via parcel, final mile, whatever. And they would get a return, and they would literally write off these returns because they didn't know what to do with it. They would just tell the customer to keep it, throw it out, or have it go somewhere and throw it out. And the retailer I was thinking of, like they said, they were getting, someone was going to go on vacation, their vacation canceled. So they returned like a ski parka in Miami, right? And they're like, I don't even know what to do with this. How do I get it back to my warehouse in, wherever it is, right? To get it out for resale if possible. Anyways, it's really interesting to see how that changed in that dynamic. So, when you think of returns, I know the continuous optimizations, looking for those, how does that impact the industry, and how's it impact what the software is doing these days?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's significant. I mean, because, you know, your returns and be able to insert your returns as pickups on your final mile legs dynamically is critical as well. You start running a first and final mile operation in the same environment, and then you start running those not with the batch routing, but during the course of the day. I mean, you could be right down the road from where a return needs to be picked up. So that, you know, as well as, you know, any exception, you know, how do you deal with any exception? You know, an attempt, a reschedule while the product's on the thing, and the automation of the workflows around that, and the automatic handling of those. I mean, you know, I love attempts because, you know, what are the rules around attempts? What are the business rules around attempts? I'm going to attempt it twice. I'm going to attempt it 3 times. Who's going to pay for the second attempt? Who's going to pay for the third attempt? You know, and how do you make sure you don't make the same mistake twice, which is you arrive at that address before 9 o'clock and the customer's only there from 11 to 1, you know, on the second attempt. So it's all about that data and the data around that order and the data around the first attempt flowing through to the second attempt, flowing through to the third attempt, or hopefully happening on the second attempt, and being billable, non-billable, and what happens then. So, you know, exception and exception management, it was one of those things that, you know, just it was a kind of that, you know, on the crossdock, it was that dark corner that had a few things. Now it's shipped off to a warehouse that's, you know, dispositioned for pennies on the dollar. So I think the people who win, or the retailers, the people who win on final mile, have a great return exception process that they can deal with cost effectively in the operation.
Yeah, think of like white glove, like appliances, right? They go out and they're removing an appliance, putting a new appliance in, then they haul that appliance somewhere to be recycled, right? I mean, it's like it's an interesting aspect of all this. And then making sure that, not so much on that one, obviously you're going to that same location, but for returns, right? Like if there's a return nearby a drop, well, I want to leverage that driver that's there, not just, I mean, clearly from a cost perspective, but also from a CO2 perspective, right? Like I'm not sending an empty truck out to pick something up and bring it back in now. So I'm cutting out empty miles. The only empty mile I have, or not, it's not even empty, I'm just going nearby to pick something up, right? So it's far more efficient in lots of ways, both cost-wise and sustainability-wise, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, that goals go back to continual optimization, and the optimizers being able to look at what is happening right now, you know, and then relook at that in 5 minutes time and make decisions to make those changes automatically.
Yeah, so you talked about the exceptions. I mean, there's so many exceptions here, right? Traffic, I mean, there's all kind of things that start to drop, and there's all kind of learning that happens as part of this as well. So, you know, what are we doing with like traffic, and how is traffic affecting final mile? Obviously, you know, time of day, there's all kind of things that come into play here, right?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Everyone asks the question, you know, does your system for routing consider time of day traffic? And yeah, you know, the answer is obvious, is in this world, yes. It's not obviously yes, because some don't, because you have to consider time of day traffic. You know, in the probably 10, 15 years ago, you'd have a curve where you made this peak and off peak. You know, now you have leg segment of that specific road going northbound, the time of day traffic for that. And your optimizer needs to consider that in building the routes. Then it needs to consider that in executing the routes on the day off, and while the vehicle's on the street. And then there's real-time events as well, and how you adjust ETA according to those real-time events that hit that. So, you know, traffic, accidents, anything that's happening ultimately gets measured against plan and adjusted, and then keep optimizing against that. So it's I mean, the data points are in the millions at that point in time. So it's interesting because, you know, as humans, we have to do that. You know, running a courier operation 15 years ago, that had to happen in somebody's head for all of his drivers on the street.
Well, that's crazy. I mean, how would, you know, and the complexity gets great or increases tremendously, right? As you add those numbers in and start to add in the variability, it's really almost completely incomprehensible to the mind, right? I mean,
the example I like to give is, you know, it's easy for somebody to put their hand in the air and a vehicle come to them. That's Uber. You know, it's hard. it's hard for a dispatcher at 9 o'clock in the morning to get an order for pickup at 3 o'clock. He sends it to a load. He doesn't think about that again. It's his day's just progressing. So he sends that 3 o'clock pickup to a driver at 10 o'clock in the morning. His best time to make that decision was probably closer to 2 o'clock, maybe closer to 2:30, depending on how far the distances are, maybe 1:30, depending on how far the distances are. So you need to be considering that order throughout the course of the day and make the decision at the last possible moment for it to be optimal. And as humans, we couldn't do that as a dispatcher. We couldn't dispatch in a different city. Imagine trying to dispatch in New York and never having lived there.
Yeah, it's like impossible, right? So that's why they're typically in this type of space, there's a lot of dispatchers, right? And they're spread out geographically. And again, what the software is allowing today is automating a lot of that and allowing it to be centralized. And they're just dealing with exceptions. They don't need to know a lot of the information that's built into the product, right? So cool stuff, man, for sure. So in the finish line, let's talk about, it doesn't end right with the optimal route, right? It ends when the stuff's delivered and everything's being finalized. So whether it's, we talked about things like chain of custody, there's driver pay, there's settlement, all types of things. I mean, where does that fall in final mile, and what is the complexity of that? Seems complex to me, but I'm simple-minded.
No, not so. But in terms of what that means, it's what is a stop? What is distance? Is it as the crow flies? Is it as the dog walks? Or is it as the car drives? And what is the agreed upon contractual distance? You might say it's as the car drives. Well, is it as the car drives by the least time, or is it as the car drives by the least miles? Because the least time, the least miles, very often you'll go on Google, send you one way on the highway, it'll cost you an extra 50% in miles, 15 miles versus 10 on street level. But your time is reduced. So where do you want to make that optimization in billing and settlement? So, billing and settlement, and then how do you take that through to billing and settlement? I always look at, mileage, which is, A to B, pretty straightforward. A to B street miles, pretty straightforward. What happens if that A to B is put in a route and B now becomes C? Now it's A to B to C. You know what I mean? So now it's the conjunctive mileage as to what is the conjunctive mileage to get it from A to B to C to D to E. And then to your point, and you've spoken about this, is what happens if the driver goes in a different direction at a point in time? Now plan and actual are different, and what does somebody pay for? So the complexity in billing and settlement. What I've learned in living the pain of all of the companies that do this is, if you can't calculate what you owe someone, you have a problem. And you have to be able to calculate what you owe someone by re-executing under your billing rules and running a post process or running your rate cards against it. So it's a very challenging process, but with the right tools and the right software, you can get a normalization of that. And especially when you're dealing with 10 couriers in a marketplace, or 10 couriers across the country, or 20 couriers across the country, settling every single one of those to the rules that are their rules and the contract, and then being able to calculate what that amount equals. Very challenging.
That's a great point. I was thinking, one of our customers, right? They have multiple couriers. They have their own internal delivery fleet, if you will. And then they also use employees to deliver stuff. And they all have different models, right, for payment. So, it's not, we talk like settlement, we're going to pay the driver. Well, it's very complicated and often very varied by the courier or the person doing the final mile delivery, right?
And then an example you came up with is great as well, because that also affects who you're going to send that order to. You might have optimization rules that say send it to this class of our employees first, then do the overflow to this class, then do the overflow to parcel. Or it could be in multiple, any of those ways up and down. So and then it's also measuring those third parties and your drivers to performance.
Right.
Did they arrive on time? Did they pick up on time? Did they deliver on time? Did they get their proof of delivery? Settlement is so complex as well because ultimately you can have bad data from the drivers. They can do a scan on event mid-route. Does that mean that they return to the depot? Did that just mean they forget to scan on one of the packages, one of the 10 that's going to a stop? And what does that do for mileage if you were to just take that as the gospel and not sanitize and automatically clean that data? So, I look at this category and I say, this is the measure of true success is, can you pay the right amount? Can you calculate the right amount and then pay the right amount always across all of your final mile?
And then let's not forget currency in there too, right? So it gets interesting, man. Well, let's move on to sort of data. You just touched on data a little bit, and thinking about the criticality of good data, obviously, right? I mean, if you think of the journey here, and think about, we talk like final mile happens. Well, somehow it gets there, right? So the combination of the TMS and final mile together, taking all that data into account and really building a true route that uses the intelligence that's in the system, it's important. So whether it's, picking a parcel carrier, giving it to a courier, whatever it might be, it's going to do the right thing throughout the process, again, to minimize costs and maximize efficiencies, right? And it's not just good enough to say I'm going to give anything less than 5 pounds to parcel. Well, that doesn't make sense really, right? So, it really just depends on, so many different factors, but it's the data that the factors are using to make the determination that becomes critical, right? So, how do you see data playing in this world, and what do you guys do to curate or resolve data issues, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's, and that's the thing, every single element at an order level, you start with an address book, and then you start with what is an address, and then you geocode it. And what is a geocode? How good is it? Is it a rooftop, which means you're spot on top of that building? Or is it approximate, which is zip centroid, and so then your final mile delivery journey has to start with good addresses, you know what I mean? And then around that address book, all of the constraints around that address. If it's a prison, it's going to take longer to get in and out, and the service time of a prison versus or a hospital where it's multi-level, multi-nursing stations versus walking up to someone's home. And then it's a service level on that order. What are you doing? Are you doing white glove? Are you doing a threshold delivery? And how much time is that going to take? When you're doing white glove, are you assembling 6 chairs, or you're just dropping off a table? You know what I mean? So around what are you delivering as well? So you start looking at the magnitude of data that comes in just to make one final mile delivery successful. Address book, order SLA, what are you delivering? What are the constraints of the vehicle for that? And then going into that in terms of, once you get that data in a place that you can actually route it and make sure that it can be executed by your team, then did they do it right? And was the execution correct? And cleaning up that data over time as well for bad data that comes back and bad process.
Yeah, I think we get a lot of customers, right, that feed us the data from multiple systems. So they've acquired businesses, they've ended up with, whether it's a shipper with multiple SAP systems or ERP systems, they're passing us an address in, and it's coming from 5 different systems, and it looks like 5 different addresses, right? But it's the same customer. So, trying to curate that data, because think about it. I mean, if you run it through final mile, you might consider it to be 5 different deliveries, right? Even though it's one delivery at one dock, right? So without having the right data, you end up with a system making bad decisions. I think you often say garbage in, garbage out kind of thing, right? And how do you can't live with that. And same thing with geocodes, where all of a sudden something doesn't get a geocode for whatever reason, it can upset the apple cart real quick and become an exception. But then how do you deal with that? Like, how do you correct it, make sure it gets fed in with a good geocode now, so that when it comes back in without one, or comes back in and it can't be determined, you have a way to get a geocode on those locations. So you start to not just get data in, but actually make data better, right? And make it more usable in the system.
Yeah, I mean, where do you store those constraints? You show up at lunch at an address, it's closed. You never want to show up at lunch again.
Yeah.
So do you have an address book that you can manage that address in future, that everyone knows that the routing constraint is never go there between 12 and 1? And all the open time and close time is simple, but the lunchtime one is that tough one. I was thinking about data. Holiday table in Europe by county. People have local holidays. How do you make sure you don't try and pick up or deliver during a local holiday?
I need to move to Europe. Yeah, I think more
I
holidays. Just kidding.
Yeah.
I can't leave data though without talking about the importance of security and keeping data safe, right? So I mean, there's two aspects to it, right? There's the sort of application data security, like the SOC 2 Type 2 stuff. MercuryGate has that, of course. And we're really, what that's really about is not so much data security as just making sure your application's secure. And by the way, you have a management process that ensures that all those that you're adhering to the rules and regulations you have for security. So pen testing, all those type of things that make sure that the application's safe. And then of course we get over to Europe, you start to talk about GDPR, right? And making sure that the data itself is protected, that data isn't getting thrown around or spewing around places it shouldn't be shared with, and protecting people's privacy. So, both aspects are really critical to data, but having good data is important on top of all that, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's, when you start dealing with all of those localities as well, and, GDPR being the example of the data not being able to leave there, and then you're starting making interfaces into other systems and making sure that that data, that server isn't there as well, and the partners are there, so it becomes it's becoming more and more relevant and more critical.
Absolutely. So let's look ahead a little bit, right? Obviously, we're seeing light from the pandemic now. I mean, it used to be you walked in a store, everybody had a mask on. Now, few people still do. I understand, but nonetheless, you start to see things lightening up. Certainly more travel to customers these days, and things just overall. What do you think the lasting impact of COVID is on Final Mile? What do you see as really changing things?
I see it as a great accelerator. It was the great accelerator. It took e-commerce, it took home delivery and made it commonplace for everyone, generationally everyone. You always saw it with, kind of the Gen X, the Gen Zs, they were always going to want deliveries at home. But, as soon as the pandemic hit for everyone else, it was the great accelerator, and the great, probably accelerated the demand on Final Mile by 5 to 10 years, in terms of how that would have organically grown. I see it in my life, but I mean, I'm sure everyone else feels it as well. The choices we make and where we'll go to buy things change because of that. So that, and then obviously the change in the workforce is obviously challenging. The change in your going into the next thing, crewless vehicles, just, finding good people to do jobs. That's also been a challenge post-pandemic, and I've been hearing about that consistently. Sourcing drivers, and then because of the driver shortage, putting some of that volume onto other parties and carriers that you can then measure and trust and use as your own workforce.
Yeah, certainly too. It's changed. If you think, the shortage of drivers, certainly. But now the use of those drivers need to be more effective and efficient than ever before, right? And they really, you don't want to be careless with routing of deliveries. You want to be as effective as you can be, so that you're not critically short of what you need to accomplish and meet, as you mentioned earlier, the expectations, right? And of course, that leads to the last bullet here, the crewless vehicles, drones, right? I mean, right now, MercuryGate's in the throes of a couple of proof of concepts on using drone technology to do final mile delivery. Obviously, it's not, you're not going to see a drone landing at your house anytime soon, bringing boxes from somewhere, but it's going to happen, and maybe not that part of it, but certainly think of remote areas, think of like folks in, Africa where their roads are limited and, 5 miles of road could take you an hour to drive, right? So, I mean, there's places where this stuff is really going to make sense. And all the things you talked about are just as real. So, and managed in the software, like chain of custody, temperature control, all those type of things are still being monitored, still being done, making sure you have the right signatures for proof of delivery, and all that stuff's critical. And those are the things that are starting to get interesting. And a lot of them are starting to be B2B kind of moves to start with, just because they're very controlled. And, there's a lot of customers that don't want drones landing at their house, or a Waymo pulling up. I mean, what do you do? Go out and get it out of the car? I was always curious about the pizza things. They show those pizza things delivering stuff. I'm like, it's like, are other people like messing around with my pizza? And I don't know how they work, right? But it's kind of like, well, how does all that work? So, again, the chain of custody becomes very important. But I think it's an interesting place, and we think a lot of times of autonomous trucks, but certainly drones and those type of things. And I think of like a drone swarm, right, where they go out in a truck, remote place, and they carry packages out. Locally here in the Raleigh area, we have guys, delivering food, albeit across the highway, but still they're delivering food via drones. It's pretty cool. So, it's getting there and they're making strides. It's slow. The government has a lot of controls, but other countries are doing a lot better with it, and it'll start to get more accepted as it happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, the acceleration there is going to happen across, even autonomous driving. We see it. We see it in the vehicles we all drive. We all see the technology filtering down to, the lowest price point in any vehicle, and and we just see that, that you can start to trust it more and more. So I think we all have a view that the crewless vehicle, regardless of it flying or being on the road or being a little. I see in Santa Monica, I see this little, I don't know what they call it, but it's a little cube that drives around on the sidewalk and goes and delivers fast food and takeout stuff. And they've got about 30 of them that just drive around at pedestrian walking pace. Fantastic, but it's how do you manage that? How do you, and for us, we don't care. We dispatching to a phone. We can dispatch to a self-driving vehicle. It's ultimately sending A and B location for this time to whatever. So it's exciting that it's going that direction. For us, I think it's going to end up just being another mode of transportation or another vehicle type that we're just going to be transmitting orders to. But I think, for the industry as a whole, it's definitely something. But where you control the pickup point and the delivery point, that's going to be in the short term. The obviously the biggest opportunity in that.
Yeah, and think about multi-pick, multi-drop drone deliveries, even, right? I mean, that's sort of the world that we've actually built stuff to do that, right? I mean, but it's not going to happen anytime in the near future. But so let's move on to I think it's a last slide, right? I don't know. Do you have any parting thoughts here before we wrap up? And
my whole feeling on the future is we are living in what we thought would be the future in a strange way. But, and in some ways that's scary, but in a lot of ways, we have the tools and we have the convergence of technology to support that. And obviously things are going to accelerate. So, it's really tools, convergence, the right partners, and you're in a good place. You have, as a business, have the ability to do things without the technology spend of the giants that weren't possible 5 or 7 years ago to even, to keep up or even go ahead, get ahead. So I think we're living in a very exciting time. And it's not just being a glass is half full. I think it's just, we know, because we see the technology, we see what else is out there, we see what else other people are using, and we know that we're right on the bleeding edge of what's possible, and we're going further. So it's exciting for our customers and future customers, because I feel like it's going to give great opportunity as to what you can do in your business. You could be a truckload expanding into final mile, and you can do that now.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started MercuryGate way back when, I had a vision of orders dropping into a TMS that then would automatically route them. And I don't mean just pick the right mode or the right truck, right? It's like a lot of moves are multiple modes, right? Like it's first mile, middle mile, maybe even a cross dock, final mile, whatever. And whether it's ocean or parcel or courier, you want to use the most effective and efficient, and this is the way you really start to become sustainable in an environment, because when you're inefficient with those decisions, you're driving costs and CO2 consumption up, right? So the golden ring is lower cost and lower CO2, right? And so it's really exciting to see the smart tools of today that really help you do all these things. You mentioned the simulator. It's so cool, right? I mean, being able to run something in an hour, that a day's worth of moves in an hour, and see the impact of things, it's just awesome stuff. And it's that type of thing that really shows how we can help folks make this step into final mile. So, we are here and eager to help and ready to help. And I think with that, we'll take some questions.
Yep.
Thanks very much, Steve and Travis. And as you said, with the time we have remaining today, we're going to be fielding some of those questions from our audience, and we've got them coming in already. To submit your questions, just remind you, open that Q&A panel on your webinar viewer. And if you're not able to get your question answered, we'll be sure and follow up with an email after our event. So first to Travis and Steve, it says, we looked at Final Mile a few years ago. How easy is it today for Final Mile software to update on the fly to incorporate new returns and pickups? And similar to your comments, we've seen a big uptick in returns and are struggling to triage those.
Go ahead, Travis.
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, it's not easy for all software to do that, because the technology that most software was built on was a batch routing infrastructure. And I can tell you the quick story is, in the infancy of probably 15, 17 years ago, we walked into a fully dynamic courier environment, 400 vehicles on the road, and they had a table tennis table with a map of St. Louis, and they're moving pins around. And they said, we want this in a computer screen. So the entire software got rewritten from the ground up back then to support a dynamic environment. How easy is it for us? It's easier. How easy is it for a traditional environment that uses batch routing to go and dynamically insert a pickup event into a route? It's pretty challenging. It's a kind of a double-sided answer. You have to be able to run a courier environment, which is a P&D dynamic operation, or an LTL, which deals with first and final on the same vehicles in a optimizing throughout the course of the day. If the software can do that, it's easy.
Well, and the timing is just so critical, right? I mean, the reason batch routing doesn't work is, the order drops and the truck that was there, 20 minutes ago is now gone. And now it's a whole different game, right? So, you said it right. It's really has to be this real-time thing going on, and continually looking at things as things get added to make sure that you get on the most efficient and effective way, right?
Okay, looks like we've got another couple questions coming in. So we do a lot of parcel. Could you talk a bit about Final Mile within the context of the parcel space?
Yeah, I'll start there. I think, I mean, certainly parcel is a big part of Final Mile. Like, where does it, you can't necessarily have couriers everywhere, right? Think about the problem, right? You see couriers maybe in metro areas, and I say metro, could be, small metro, right? It doesn't have to be New York or something, but you see couriers in the metro areas. But certainly parcel is a great option for lots of type of deliveries. I mean, and maybe I don't have the volumes to warrant having a courier in this area. And the parcel guys, they do a great job. But if you look even at like a year or so ago, they were swamped, right? They couldn't handle it. Yeah, and people were turning more and more to couriers because they just couldn't get their throughput through the parcel guys, right? And look, they're doing a great job, and the USPS has stepped up, right? So everything's looking better, and I think everything's in a good place. And the parcel guys are just another tool in our arsenal of delivery.
Yeah, and I think there should be a tool that's evaluated against all modes at all point in time, from a delivery date perspective and a cost perspective. And then, the interesting thing about parcel is it is a final mile mode, really, when you look at it. So it has all the same problems and constraints. Is the address right? If the address is not right, you're going to pay for it. It's going to cost you, and what does that mean? And so, I believe it's a really exciting, kind of tool in the tool belt to always, throw all of your orders against, and should be evaluated holistically. You got 1,000 orders. What should you do with them? Some should go parcel, some should go courier, some should go to truckload and then potentially courier, or truckload and potentially parcel.
Or employees even, right? Yeah. So
Yes.
it's what smart transportation is all about, right? So.
And looks like we've got just about time for one more question. We'll jump to that. So in your experience, how do you see TMS and final mile software solutions working together today?
Well, it's kind of what I was talking about with the smart stuff, right? It's really making the right determination as you go through the entire process, and knowing the right tool to use, or the right carrier to use, or mode to use, or however you want to describe that, right? Whether it's cross-docking, we have some customers that do this, do low zone parcel deliveries, right? So they're moving parcel shipments across the country, delivering into different zones. And when they deliver to those cross docks, they pick up stuff to go to the next zone, if you will. So they're all trying to make everything low zone, or they go into couriers as well. So it's that type of smart, decision making. So not everything gets fed to a final mile product, right? I don't need to necessarily use final mile, so to speak, or continuous optimization for a container move, right? It's not like I'm gonna pick up and drop and do different things as it's moving. Now I might look at traffic and those type of things, sure, but nonetheless, it's a different thing. So we want to make sure we're leveraging the right tool for the right decision, and we think the combination of the TMS and other tools, our Ocean and Final Mile, are all being used properly, right? And it's the TMS that pulls that all together.
Okay, and I do see we have a few more questions. Unfortunately, we're approaching the end of our time together. We'll make sure and respond to those questions directly to each one of you. For now, we'll conclude our webinar, and thanks everyone for sharing so much of your time with us today. Special thanks as well to our MercuryGate experts, Steve Blau and Travis Schmidt, for sharing a lot of great information. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ron.
And thanks, everybody.
To learn more about MercuryGate smart transportation solutions and the final mile tools we've discussed here today, visit MercuryGate.com. That's where you can find out about our TMS and our final mile solutions. You can also access regular transportation industry trends, updates in our Knowledge Center. Just look for the logistics landscape in the industry reports section of our resources page. You'll get updated economic indicators, news insights from our experts, our partners, and the transportation industry at large. On behalf of our MercuryGate presenters and everyone at MercuryGate International, thank you for joining us for this look at the logistics landscape.